All right, we're now joined via Zoom by the spokesperson of the South African Federation of Trade Unions. A very good afternoon to you, Trevor. Shaku, thanks very much for joining us here on SABC News, sir.
Thank you, Flo, and thanks for having us.
I mean, I'm sure you heard the Minister of Basic Education talking about the need to find stability and normality. Otherwise, as she said, we won't be able to recover from the disruptions. Let's talk about your viewpoint in terms of this year's calendar in relation to learning and school environment, and really just going full capacity and full learning instead of one day in, one day out, or whatever the systems that the different schools had been doing. Where do you stand on this issue?
The points we have made last year were actually in relation to the concerns around the question of the classroom sizes, the number of teachers in schools, and because these two elements correlate with the number of learners who are costed or given to teachers in classrooms, for instance. And that for us was a serious concern. And in this instance, where you have had 2 years of disrupted learning in terms of COVID-19 because of problems brought by social distancing, where schools which normally would have had 50 learners, 60 learners in classrooms now had to reduce their numbers to 20 in order to meet the COVID-19 regulation of 1.2 meter social distancing in classrooms between desks and seats of learners, would have in a way introduced a radically transformed education environment in which teachers would have had a chance to be able to interact more with their learners. Teachers would have had chance to be able to know their learners, but most importantly, even accord enough time to those who have learning barriers, which were related to either intellectual or even beyond that. Now, if the government's desire to return to normal schooling was to come to fruition, what you would have is that you would return to the normal schooling, which is abnormal, in a sense that you would be returning to those classrooms with learner to teacher ratio of 1:40, 1:50 in classrooms. So the problems would have arisen there. But as we have highlighted last year, the major issue around this is the question of teacher enrollment or head count in the education department in its entirety. When Minister Njimtshaga spoke to Parliament in March, April last year, reported that there were about 24,000 of teaching posts which were not filled in the department. But on top of that, we have seen around September, October last year that KZN had actually formally closed 6,000 of those teaching posts. As a result, you now have lesser population of teachers versus an increasing population of learners. Now, this is bound to create a serious problem in as far as the learner-teacher ratio or the crowding in the classrooms is concerned. And you would necessarily have serious problems if you want to return to the normal schooling in as much as you'd return to the pre-COVID-19 period.
So I'm not clear then, Trevor, in terms of where SAFTU is standing, because so far you've raised those concerns and very valid concerns that you're raising. So in terms of the return to full 100% capacity to the schools, I'm not sure where you're standing then as SAFTU. You acknowledge the fact that there are problems and there are concerns, and are you then agreeing that schools are simply not ready or equipped enough to then deal with full capacity as other unions have been calling for? I mean, let's put aside the issue of the concerns that you raise, and they are certainly valid issues. Do you then agree or disagree with 100% capacity return?
We desire that schools should return to 100 capacity return. But like I said, the problem is that are you going to be able to keep social distancing in those particular classrooms if you are not taking into consideration the current prevailing situation at schools, which is a question of overcrowding, because normality in schools means overcrowding. So though our desire is that schools must return to 100% capacity, we are concerned that they are not going to be able in the process to adhere to social distancing protocols which the Department of Health would have stipulated. Now, we lay the blame squarely with government, because in the main, it is government which was supposed to have built infrastructure for schools. It was government which was supposed to have, at least as it has promised at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, at least provided the mobile classrooms to schools. It was government which should have hired more teachers to ensure that there would be a lesser classroom ratio to teacher in a number of public schools, or in all public schools, because as things stand, like I said, it's a serious abnormality, because we find learners 40, 50, 60, even 70 in other schools in one classroom. So our desire, however, is limited by the realities which we are confronted with, which have actually been brought upon by government's failure to ensure that it resources the public sector and education in particular in this instance.
Yeah.
And you would have...
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask, in terms of, are you indeed holding government accountable? I mean, we can sit here and blame government, but you're at the forefront. You're the unions that can certainly be the ones that are most vocal and have that access in terms of talking to the education department about the issue of building the infrastructure that you speak of. I mean, in an earlier conversation I was having with Matakanya from the National Association of School Governing Bodies, we're talking about the fact that there might actually not be enough schools, and we're hearing about mobile classrooms being delivered, but that's not really sustainable, especially long term. And I wonder if unions such as yourselves are being vocal enough in terms of saying, listen, let's build more schools, because ultimately this is where all these issues emanate from. The fact that we're having parents standing outside schools right now in long queues waiting for their children to be admitted into certain schools, and all that frustration that comes with it, and some of the frustrations that you're speaking of now in terms of too many children or too many learners in a classroom. These can all be addressed by building more schools, and you're correctly placed to be raising some of these issues, and are you?
Yes, the South African Federation of Trade Unions has raised these issues consistently in its statements, but also in protest pickets which we have organized together with community organizations and activists last year. Of particular importance was one during the medium-term budget policy statement, in which it was highlighted that from 2021 to 2023 financial years, you would have a reduction of 2.8 billion rands in the entire basic education. And because of that, you are bound to have these particular problems. And unions and federations like SAFTU, who consistently raise these issues, actually raise these issues to deaf ears, because the African National Congress and its alliance partners, in particular COSATU, because COSATU is directly involved with the ruling party, and as a result, we would even say that directly involved to a particular extent in government. And because they are not listening to federations like ourselves, they are not listening to other voices or so-called excluded voices out there, which are community activists, which are community organizations, which consistently raise the question and the issues around the fiscal restraint, or what we call the neoliberal austerity measures, the budget cuts which are being carried by government on public expenditure of goods and services. So in this instance, we have been raising these issues. It is government which has been refusing to listen to us. Because in most instances, if you speak to a government which first and foremost has predicated its policy on a neoliberal dogma and fails fails to listen to people who want to expand the fiscus, or at least argue for expansion of fiscus and expenditure on public goods and services, you would speak to really a deaf ear, and these people will never listen. And this is the reason why we have declared, as the South African Federation of Trade Unions 2022, as a year of mass rolling action, in which we'll start on the 24th of November or whenever the budget speech would be in February, to begin those particular programs of mass rolling action, fighting first and foremost to ensure that expenditure on public goods and services is augmented so that our health system, our education system, social development, police, correctional service are able to get necessary funding, which will allow them to build adequate infrastructure, but most importantly, hire the personnel, because you can build the infrastructure, but if you do not hire the personnel, believe you me, you are going to still run into problems. For instance, as I've said, in the schools, even if you build more schools but do not hire more teachers, you are going to have problems of overcrowding, because eventually you are going to have to ensure that you do not overload those teachers. So by not overloading those particular teachers, you can't stretch them into various classes. So you have classes which are empty, even though they are available in physical terms in the school. So you have to really coincide that project of building infrastructure in schools with hiring of teachers. But this government is not committed to that, because it has been retrenching through what we call attrition. Many teachers, and it has closed many schools, about more than 1,000 in the Eastern Cape late last year. So on its own, this spells doom for our people, but also in relation to your question, shows that government is really blind and deaf to the cries of our people and to the social activists, political activists and trade unionists who are arguing for expansion of expenditure on public goods and services.
All right, Mr. Trevor Shaku, thanks very much for giving us your time here on SABC News. We certainly appreciate your input, sir.
Thank you very much.